Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Oya Hoca, Professor Dr. Oya Batu Menteşe. Professor Menteşe is a graduate of Ankara University, Department of English Language and Literature, where she received her BA. Upon graduation from the university in 1965, she became a teaching assistant at Hacettepe University, Department of English Language and Literature, which just opened that year. As the first teaching assistant of the department. She received her PhD at Hacettepe University in 1972, became assistant professor in 1977, and full professor in 1988 at the same university. For her postdoctorate, she studied for a year at Georgia State University in the USA in 1974. She visited Cambridge University at various times to take part in Cambridge seminars with British Council scholarships, also completed an Oxford University summer school program and several Warwick University seminars, again with British Council scholarships. Between 1993 and 1994, she worked as founding dean of Lefke University in Northern Cyprus. She was chairperson between 1997 and 1999 of the Department of English Language and Literature at Hacettepe University. In 1999, she asked for an early retirement from Hacettepe University to join Atılım University. At Atılım University, she was chairperson from 1999 to 2006, vice rector between 2000 and 2002, and dean between 2000 and 2012. She has published 2 books, some book chapters, 1 translated play, more than 100 national and international articles, conference papers on English, American, Turkish and French literature and culture. She is presently consultant in the President's Office and a member of the Board of Trustees. Her presentation today is entitled Representations of Space as Heterotopia in Heart of Darkness, Small Place and Enigma of Arrival.
Thank you very much, Hande. I hope you don't fall asleep. We all ate too much. So I shall try to be as clear as possible. The older generation will know that academics and students of postcolonial studies tend to prefer themes dealing with colonial and postcolonial construction of identity more than any other theme. And papers abound on such subjects as othering, stereotyping, mimicry, hybridity, alienation, and the like. Yet issues of place and space have always occupied an important place, both in postcolonial texts and postcolonial studies, such as place displacement, the relation between place and self, the construction of place, the difficulty in describing place, etc. Yet recently, representations of place as meaningful space have gained a new significance. Papers on representations of space have begun to outnumber other topics, which in turn have created a new need to look at space as a concept, not as a linguistic sign only. What is meant by space as a postcolonial, postmodern and feminist and contemporary concept? Henri Lefebvre, in his book The Production of Space, published in 1974, thoroughly investigates the concept of space in its historical context from classical to modern times. He claims that space has always had philosophical meanings and often given divine attributes, which included it in the realm of the absolute. But, says Lefebvre, the absolute is everywhere and nowhere, and unchanging. It's representational space. Whereas, adds Lefebvre, space in modern times has developed from being a geographical, mathematical concept, an empirical scientific definition, to abstractions of meaning that are heterogeneous and multiple. Thus, place as we know it does not exist anymore. Places are spaces with meaning. Place as a physical area, a geographical location, becomes meaningful with lived experience. Culture and history have created layers and layers of meaning in places and turned them into spaces. Foucault, in a lecture referring to Lefebvre, stresses that in our lives we no longer express development or change in terms of time, but in terms of space. He furthermore talks about the problematization of space in his article Des Espaces Autres, published in 1967. He says, the present epoch will perhaps be an epoch of space. We are in the epoch of simultaneity, we are in the epoch of juxtaposition, the epoch of the near and the far, of the side-by-side, of the dispersed. There is no transparent or neutral space. Gupta and Ferguson, in Beyond Culture, Space, Identity and Politics of Difference, an article published in 1992, state that representations of space as autonomous has enabled the power of topography to conceal successfully the topography of power. Jameson in 1984 talks about postmodern hyperspaces, spaces that are re-territorialized and reconceptualized through power structures. Thus, we are to understand that spaces are complex constructions, networks of power structures, often intersecting with one another. Representations of space are not direct reflections of real-life places. They may be reflections of cultural meanings, religious meanings, ideological meanings, and the like, varying with individual or cultural groups. Following post-colonialism, all places are hybridized and re-territorialized through new global interconnections. Post-coloniality has further problematized the relationship between space and culture. Now cultural areas overlap several nation states and occupy wider spaces. Thus, representations of the world as a collection of countries, each embodying its own distinctive culture and society, is an oversimplification. Postcolonial studies has overlapped with postmodernity in a number of ways. The postmodern idea that space has been reconstructed and reconceptualized, and that ideology and power play an important role in the production of space, is also shared by postcolonial theory. Heterotopia, as a term describing space, is a term which enters literature by way of postmodernism. Foucault uses the term heterotopia to describe spaces that have more layers of meaning or relationships to other places than immediately meet the eye. He compares heterotopia with utopia. Utopia is an idealized space, and heterotopia is a parallel space that contains the undesirable or the unpleasant to make a space a utopia. Heterotopias are spaces that exhibit dual meanings. According to Foucault, heterotopia can be a single real place that juxtaposes several spaces of meaning. Laura Rice, in her 2003 article of Heterotopias and Ethnospaces, Production of Space in Post-Colonial North Africa, claims that identity is destabilized by heterotopic spaces because they exhibit dual meanings. She further claims that, again based on Foucault and Lefebvre, heterotopias are found in every culture, and they are material places that serve as mirrors of other real sites and destabilize meanings. As a cemetery, the city of the dead would destabilize a living city by building a relationship between the living and the dead, meaningful but uncomfortable. Homi Bhabha, in an interview published in 1990, talks about the concept of third space as the space of hybridity, which is a post-colonial theory of identity and culture. To Bhabha, third space is where the oppressed and the oppressor come together and new hybrid positions emerge. Edward Soya, a postmodern political geographer, joins in the discussion of third space theory and claims that third space often crosses boundaries of established norms. It is where everything comes together, Subjectivity and objectivity, the abstract and the concrete, the real and imagined, the knowledge and the unimaginable, the repetitive and the differential, structure, agency, mind, body, consciousness and the unconscious, everyday life and unending history. Thus, such analytical discussions forces academics to reevaluate once more the concepts of culture and cultural difference. This is what this paper is about. This paper claims that space as represented in the novels under discussion are complex heterotopias in which cultural ideologies overlap, opposites are juxtaposed, layers of meaning and hybrid positions are exhibited, akin to what has been called third space by Homi Bhabha and Edward Soya. The three novels discussed in this paper are structured around the metaphor of space. The first novel to be considered in this context, Heart of Darkness, and I'm sure everyone has read this novella, especially the older generation, by Joseph Conrad, is in fact a novella of the colonial period and an early representation of the ideology of European colonialism. The time of the story is early 20th century, during one of the ugliest phases of European colonialism. The setting is the Belgian Congo in Africa, where the natives are being exploited for ivory by Belgian and European trading companies. The degree of the exploitation is reflected firstly in the title with the word darkness, and epitomized in the dying word of Kurtz, the horror, who is the major but little seen character of the story. The term incomprehensible or incomprehensibility, repeated many times by the narrator Marlowe, puts it as he is repeated by Marlowe, as he is trying to define and comprehend the meaning of the experience in the Congo, has provoked innumerable interpretations in the literary world and still looms large over English studies. Another much debated subject has been the question of whether Marlowe and Conrad himself share in this colonial project and its ideology, since Marlowe seems to be part of the mission for financial reasons or for adventure, as he claims. Yet the sardonic and ironic statements and observations are revealing of the reality behind the facade. The novella is a story within a story, as you all know. Marlowe, the narrator, is an old experienced sailor who is recounting a youthful adventure to his sailor friends who are all past their prime. As Marlowe's story unfolds, we see him journeying in a boat up the river Congo from the outer station to the company's inner station, where Kurtz, the legendary agent of the company, legendary because he has collected the greatest amount of ivory, is lying sick. Marlowe's duty is to retrieve Kurtz, hopefully before he dies. As the boat goes deeper and deeper into the jungle, Marlowe finds himself in strange, unrecognized grounds, alien to everything he has known and experienced so far. In trying to understand the meaning and nature of the jungle, he begins to reconceptualize the place, turning into a space of complex meanings. To him, the jungle seems to have a secret life of its own, hidden under the stillness, and the stillness seems ominous. This strange world of plants, says Marlowe, and water and silence, and stillness of life, did not in the least resemble a peace. It was the stillness of an implacable force, brooding over an inscrutable intention. It looked at you with a vengeful aspect. The jungle dominates the novel. It is central to the meaning of the story. Its inscrutable intention, its evil intent, as Marlowe puts it, threatens the colonizers to the depths of their being. No longer controlled by the laws of their civilization, they are now on strange grounds, open to the temptations of the jungle. That mysterious life of the wilderness that stirs in the forest, in the jungles, in the heart of wild man. And there is no initiation either into such mysteries. He has to live in the midst of the incomprehensible, which is also the detestable, and it has a fascination, too, that goes to work upon him, the fascination of abomination. Marlowe's representation of this new neutral space as possessing some kind of evil intention is also based on his utter ignorance of the natives. His judgment of them is based on the idea of the other. Yet he at the same time has had initiation into the ambitions of the white man's heart. The fascination of the abomination is the greed in white man's heart. Marlowe sees that the white are taken over by the conquering darkness of the jungle, as he observes how the natives are exploited at various stations and the full length of the futility and devastation which ironically clashes with the ideology of bringing civilization. Strings of dusty niggers with splay feet arrived and departed. A stream of manufactured goods, rubbishy cottons, beads, brass wire sent into the depths of darkness, and in return came a precious trickle of ivory. But are the natives abominable? Are they part of the conquering darkness? As Marlowe and a few whites float up the river with a bunch of hungry and tired cannibals, Marlowe wonders why the cannibals don't eat them, since they are humans with human needs and are much stronger than the whites. Yes, I looked at them as you would on human beings, with a curiosity of their impulse, motives, capacities, weaknesses, when brought to the test of inexorable physical necessity, hunger. Restraint. What possible restraint? Was it superstition, disgust, patience, fear of some kind, or some primitive honor? Marlowe, when he finally meets the dying Kurds, says that Kurds has no restraint which the hungry natives possessed. My ivory, my intended, my ivory, my station, my river, my everything belonged to him. The jungle, that conquering darkness, had completely taken over Kurds. The African jungle is a heterotopic space which juxtaposes the colonizer and the colonized, primitive culture and civilized culture, the space of international imperialism with the space of wild primitive life. So the jungle is also a third space, an in-between space, a discontinuous space of different realities. When in the end Marlowe goes to meet in Brussels Kurtz's intended after his death and lies to her about Kurtz's black mistress in the Congo, he wonders if he too could have been claimed by the powers of darkness. The thing Marlowe was to know after he found Kurtz in his deathbed was what he, Marlowe, belonged to, how many powers of darkness claimed him for their own. The novel reflects the anxiety of representation according to Homi Bhabha. To Bhabha, the incomprehensible, as stated by Marlowe, is associated with the production of transcultural narratives. And he quotes Frederick Jameson, who says, "I take such strange descriptions of space," says Frederick Jameson, "as symptoms and expression of a new and historically original dilemma, one that involves our insertion as individual subjects into a multi-dimensional set of discontinuous realities." The next novel, Jamaica, Kincaid's Novella, A Small Place, is the story of a very specific geographical place, like the Congo in Conrad's novel. A small idyllic island, Antigua, in the Caribbean, once a British colony and one of the smallest among the Caribbean islands. The novel is not set on this island, it's about this island. It's about how this place, by juxtaposing and simultaneously bringing together the local and the far, the beautiful and the ugly, the utopic and dystopic, the colonized and the colonizer, becomes a heterotopic third space. In the first chapter, the writer-narrator looks at the landscape from the eyes of a tourist who has just landed on the island and is overtaken by the spectacular view. She addresses the tourist as the tourist person. As your plane descends to land, you might say, "What a beautiful island Antigua is, more beautiful than any other islands you have seen." And they were all very beautiful in their way. The sun shines, the climate is deliciously hot, the tourist is admiring and delighted, emerging from the customs into the hot, clean air. Immediately you feel cleansed, says Kincaid. Immediately you feel blessed. This first look at Antigua is continually undercut by the narrator's asides on the real Antigua. The taxi driver cheats, he is reckless, and the roads are very bad. The tourist passes by a broken down, dusty building which turns out to be a school. Another broken down building, once the library, destroyed in the earthquake, has a sign which reads, "Repairs are pending." The sign has been there for a decade with its unfulfilled promise. At the hotel, the tourist does not know that the shower which refreshes him and the contents of his lavatory end up in the ocean where he will be swimming. Kincaid pictures not only devastation behind the facade of the beautiful island, but also corruption. Besides the American embassy, the most remarkable building on the island rises another remarkable mansion, the home of a drug smuggler, who is so rich that he buys cars in tens, of an expensive Japanese model, because the two main car dealers in Antigua are in business with a certain Japanese car firm. All cars, new or old, make a strange noise, for they use leaded gasoline, imported by some crook. Nobody has heard of unleaded gasoline on the island. The narrator attracts your attention once more to the beauty of the island, for contrast with what lies behind it. Antigua is beautiful. Antigua is too beautiful. Sometimes the beauty of it seems unreal, for no sunset could look like that. No real seawater could strike that many shades of blue at once. No real sky could be that shade of blue, another shade of blue. But no real cloud could be that white. No real day could be that sort of sunny and bright. In spite of the beauty, Antigua is no utopia as indicated by the corruption. People live in it as if they live in a prison. For, says Kincaid, they have no big historical moment to compare the way they are now to the way they used to be. No historical revolution, no revelation of any kind, no age of anything. For they have seen the world through England only, as Kincaid claims in her rage and frustration. I met the world through England, and if the world wanted to meet me, it would have to do so through England. Her language becomes fiercely ironic as she says, the English should never have left home, for they loved England, therefore everywhere they went they turned into England. But no place could really be England, and nobody who did not look exactly like them could ever be English. So you can imagine the destruction of people and the land that comes from that, says Kincaid. She calls the British colonialists criminals. As she does so, she realizes that the only language in which she can speak of this crime is English, the language of the criminal. But the criminal deeds must also be spoken in this language. You loved knowledge, and wherever you went, you made sure to build a school, a library. Yes. And in both of these places, she says, you distorted or erased my history and glorified your own. Thus, Britain is included into the picture through Kincaid's long soliloquy in this manner. And the beautiful, idyllic island, which at one look is utopic, is turned into a dystopia. The visible beauty, along with layers and layers of devastation and corruption, create a heterotopic space, a hybridized space of dual meanings, destabilizing the meaning of what we think as real. Yet the third space, if we may speak of a third space, has not created hybrid identities at this stage, but a childlike peoples who are mimics of their masters. When the slaves were freed, adds Kincaid, once they threw off their master's yoke, they no longer were human rubbish, as the colonizers would see them. Neither are they noble and exalted, as history would have them. For the coming together of the two cultures has completely erased the local and left a childlike peoples who mimicked their masters in the worst possible way. The novel's narrator, Kincaid, is very emotionally involved in what she's saying, and she's angry and filled with rage, demanding compensation and retribution, which does not seem to be possible as things stand. The third novel, The Enigma of Arrival, again probably many of you have read it, by V.S. Naipaul. How are spatial meanings established? Who has the power to turn places into spaces? Naipaul himself, as the narrator of the novel, comments on this as such. Land is not land alone, something that simply is itself. Land partakes of what we breathe into it, is touched by our moods and memories. The Enigma of Arrival is a novel about land, places which are spaces where different cultures and different identities meet to create new meanings. The narrator is Naipaul himself, and the greater part of the novel is meditation upon the diverse meanings of existence, identity, creativity, represented through representations of space. It is unlike Naipaul's previous novels in that it is autobiographical. Indian Caribbean-born Naipaul, who had left his home, Trinidad, with an Oxford scholarship to become a writer, is now a successful British naturalized novelist who has been living in England for 20 years. The main story takes place in one location, actually, in a rural part of England, in a cottage and its vicinity, which Naipaul temporarily rents to get away from his fear of change and death, accompanied by a writer's block. The cottage is in Wiltshire, in the town of Salisbury, an English town which the writer-narrator had known from a painting by Constable. The cottage is within the grounds of an old manor with a view of Stonehenge. It's a place to get away from, as he tells us, the weariness which he had experienced many times before and which now has caused him to rent the cottage and to reflect on his inability to fit in or to belong to one culture, even after 20 years. Not only the weariness of the writing, but also the weariness of being in England, the rawness of my nerves as a foreigner, the weariness of my insecurity, social, racial, financial, and to put an end to the distortion of personality that had begun on the very day I left home, that day when the Pan American plane, taking me up a few thousand feet above the island where I lived all my life, had shown me a pattern of fields and colors I had never seen before. The title of the novel fits perfectly with this feeling of estrangement. It is taken from a painting by the Surrealist painter Chirico and pictures two people who have landed from a ship, looking lost and forlorn. The painting was named by the French poet Apollinaire, who, like Naipaul, must have felt the same dislocation and estrangement displayed in the painting. The narrator discovers more about the place he had escaped to as he begins to take long walks on the countryside and to give it meanings. As a writer-intellectual steeped in English literature and culture, his early representations of space around the cottage are artistic and literary. The name of the village, Waldenshire, and the manor grounds are first linguistic references. Walden and Shaw meant wood. Stonehenge was historical. There was a fairy tale feel about the place when it snowed. He took long morning walks deep into the country, past the cottages and farmyards, and is overwhelmed by the sense of space. The setting felt ancient. The impression was of space, unoccupied land, the beginning of things. The beginning of things indicates, as in Conrad's novel, the primordial, before civilization, and before the Industrial Revolution. Thus, he idealizes the surroundings and the people in it. One of the tenants, Jack, whom he admired for having built a garden at the edge of a swamp, seems a remnant of old peasantry, like a butterfly who had survived time. Jack's father-in-law, a Wordsworthian figure in a Lake District solitude. It seemed to Naipaul that he had a historical part of England all to himself. A country church he went by was part of the wealth and security of Victorian Edwardian times. The town Amesbury was an old place where Guinevere, King Arthur's queen, met her lover Lancelot. It was an unchanging world, a slow movement of time. Things don't change. Death does not threaten perfection. His landlord does not represent imperial decline, but a continuation. The gardener was dressed in a country gentlemanly style. The farm manager and his wife had no decay in their eyes. In short, he creates a utopian space which really does not exist. For the small valley, which seems so secure, is surrounded by the activities of modern metropolitan life. Highways with heavy traffic, new buildings rising to the sky, airplanes flying over, and a military base nearby from where guns are fired. The land is already a heterotopia. In time, he comes to realize that his landlord is not so rich as he thought. He is a sick man. There are no idealized lives or people on the manor. There's a murder, a love triangle, a divorce among the tenants. His favorite tenant, Jack, dies. The new dairyman is ugly. The new tenants looked on the land as merely work. The old farm was broken down and a new prefabricated shed was put in its place. Everything was being renewed or discarded. He comes to realize that this utopic space he had created was an illusion. The emptiness, the spaciousness through which I had felt myself walking was an illusion, as the idea of forest behind the young pines. All around and not far away were roads and highways, with brightly colored trucks and cars like toys. Stonehenge, the barrows, the tumuli outlined against the sky, the army firing ranges, the old and the new. Yet the novel ends in a positive note in spite of his disappointment, with the acceptance that things inevitably change, and each generation remake their own identities and their own lives. The final chapter of the novel goes back to the beginning of the story, to his decision to write about the experience of the manor under the title of Enigma of Arrival. The decision which comes to him following his younger sister's death, his return to Trinidad for her funeral, means the breaking of the writer's block, as he observes how his city, Trinidad, and the Caribbean and its inhabitants have changed, both physically and culturally. His fear of decay is replaced by an acceptance of change and flux, and new identities achieved in the face of change and intercultural relations. As he looks back at his life left behind, he says, "We had made ourselves anew. We couldn't go back. There was no ship of antique shape now to take us back. We had come out of the nightmare, and there was nowhere else to go." This is his third space, the acceptance of his dual identity, and the fact that one has to continue in the face of change. Thank you very much.
Professor Menteşe, thank you so much for this most illuminating speech. I think we can take a few questions. Now the floor is open for questions,
And
comments.
So if there are none.
All right, thank you so much.
Everybody ate too much, that's why.
Ben çantanı falan tutabilirim istersen. Çok teşekkür
I had to create some sensation, so I'm sorry. I thought this way I would draw attention. Well, fortunately, or unfortunately, what I'm going to talk about today is the idea of violence in society, and I think it is one of the very popular and common things that we have been discussing so far. So I thought, and since our topic is culture and society in literature, I thought that would be an appropriate topic to talk about. And if we consult several...
I know you don't need an introduction.
I'm sorry. You have to excuse it because of the fall.
I was actually going to say that it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Canlı Gülsen Hoca, and certainly she doesn't need an introduction. I'm sure that she speaks for herself.
Yes,
yeah, well, perhaps as a dramatist, you wanted to dramatize the situation. Don't do it again. It's actually, I was going to also try to give some sort of energy or energize the crowd, announcing that actually we're going to have our coffee break after this session. Okay, and now the very brief introduction. Professor Canlı is a graduate of Ankara University, and she received her PhD from Hacettepe University. It's kind of perhaps. She worked as assistant and associate professor and professor in the English department at Hacettepe University. Between 1982 and 1994, she also held the founding dean position in the Faculty of Fine Arts of Hacettepe University. She also worked as a visiting professor at Warwick University, UK, in the academic years of 1994-95, and then again in 2000 and 2001. She participated and presented papers in several international conferences and published many articles on English literature and fine arts. She conducted numerous MA and PhD theses. Her main area of interest is English literature, are drama, fiction, and cultural studies. And she's been teaching and working in the English department at Atılım University since 2003. And today, as she already announced, she's going to talk to us about violence in Sarah Kane's Blasted. And Professor Canlı from you.
Thank you very much, Huri. It's a pleasure to be chaired by one of my former students, and it really is a great pleasure to be sharing the same position, the same desk, or the same platform with her. Thank you very much. Thank you. As I had already begun telling you, violence, one of the most popular issues nowadays, not only in our society, but all over the world. And so I thought it would be a fit subject to deal with. If we consult several different dictionaries, we see that they have a definition, a similar definition for the word violence. If we look at, for example, Oxford English Dictionary, it defines violence as behavior involving physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something. This seems to be a human behavior, and it is not a new phenomenon. Archaeological findings, and history show that violence has existed even in hunter societies among Greeks, Egyptians, and Romans. And today it seems to have assumed a global scale, and we see it practiced, we see it present in almost every society today. In one form or other, it exists, it is present in daily life, in the street, in schools, in homes, in shops, in short, everywhere. How is it then possible that human beings who are supposed to be the most civilized of all species are capable of displaying violence? One of the most frequently discussed and studied issues is violence. It is taken by anthropologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and it has become an important issue. And so the issue is discussed among the scientific and legal authorities as well. And differing opinions as to the cause of violence, why it exists in human societies, has been a topic which has not been reached a common agreement on. And we see that several authorities have talked about violence and defined it and talked about the cause of it, and they explained it by different reasons. And we see that all of these theories put down by the authorities seem to be dealing with only one specific aspect of violence. And we don't seem to have an all-comprising framework put down by any of these authorities. For example, we refer to age-old Freud, and he, of course, explains it with human id, and he says that it is born afresh in every child. Then we turn to Nietzsche, and he argues that violence is innate and is hard-wired in human constitution. Carl Jung, for his part, explained it with the human unconscious, which has personal and collective aspects. He posited that if fears, feelings of guilt, and collective aspects and sense of inferiority remain repressed and not integrated into the conscious ego, it is projected onto other people. Therefore, according to him, according to Jung, the sources of violence is the process of protection and scapegoating. An anthropologist, an American anthropologist, Ernest Becker, for his part, explains violence with the fear of mortality, while German psychologist Alice Miller relates it to personal history. And again, an American psychiatrist, James Gilligan, believes violence is the result of humiliation. And Kierkegaard, for his part, says that violence is ill will towards self in the process of becoming. It is not only psychologists who are interested in the issue of violence. 20th century dramatists also have shown an interest in the issue. For example, Edward Bond, one of the first dramatists in the 20th century to include violence in his own drama, said that violence is not a function of human nature, but of human societies. Because, he said, human nature is not fixed at birth. It is created through our relation to the culture of our social relations. And, he said, quote, we are violent because we have not yet made those relationships civilized, unquote. He further adds that violence is not caused only by physical threat, but also by threats to human dignity. The reason for this interest of playwrights in the issue of violence is the fact that all artists, including dramatists, reflect what they see around themselves in their artworks. and in their place in the case of dramatists. Like all artistic creations, drama may be considered as a mirror held to the world in which the dramatist is living. It is for this reason that history of drama is filled with plays reflecting the violence that has existed in different ages and in different societies. The examples of violence in different periods of history and their reflections in drama may indicate that there is a correlation between social conditions and the material used in the dramatic output of the period. That is, the characters in a play reflect the culture-produced violence in a society. The aim of this paper, in short, is to prove the validity of the claim that not only personal factors, but also sociocultural conditions are responsible for the violence that we witness everywhere, by using the example of Sarah Kane's Blasted, which is an example of in-your-face theater. The supporting theory will be general aggression model put down by De Waal, Anderson, and Bushman. Anderson and Carnegie define violence as the predominant evil in societies, which is an intentional act of causing harm to others. General aggression model posits that aggression and the resulting violence are caused by a combination of personal and cultural factors. They suggest that a person's social behavior is shaped by his present environment and his personality, which is a set of stable knowledge structures that an individual uses to interpret events and guide his behavior. Anderson and his colleagues postulate that violence is caused by a conjunction of numerous proximate and distal risk factors. The first group, that is the proximate risk factors, consists of such variables as personality traits, the individual's interpretation of events, his beliefs, and his typical responses to events, and such situational factors as presence of guns, alcohol, drugs, frustration, personal exposure to violence, physical discomfort or pain. Distal factors, on the other hand, include biological and environmental factors. Biological factors consist of brain and genetic disorders, and environmental factors include cultural norms, maladaptive families, deprivation, difficult life conditions, and violent neighborhood. In other words, social behavior depends on personal self-regulating processes and on the individual's present environment. Anderson and Carnegie also claim that effective, instrumental, impulsive, premeditated, proactive, and reactive aggressions are the 6 types of aggression. In line with this theory, it may be claimed that the specific aggressive and violent behavior displayed by characters in Sarah Kane's play Blasted are the outcome of a combination of personal and sociocultural conditions in the 20th and 21st centuries. The 20th century witnessed great material achievements, but the peaceful balance people sought was shattered by 2 great world wars and an economic depression. The changing world map and the prevailing conditions led to a world without a perspective for a future. As a result, human relations took on new definitions, understanding of morality changed, communication technologies replaced direct personal contact. Instances of global political strifes, bomb explosions, hijacking of airplanes, and domestic violence became routine practices. The continuing social disturbances in the 21st century and feelings of discontent, together with the economic hardships, added to people's fears, insecurity, and bewilderment. Swiss scholar Walter Burkert and Charles Bellinger draw attention to another fact, that in the 20th century, and during the following 2 decades of the 21st century, more and more blood and violence began, quote, to lurk fascinatingly at the heart of religions. They further add that all orders and forms of violence are founded on institutionalized religions. Quote, therefore, violence has always been present in the center of human life, unquote. Sacrificing of animals, the crucifixion of Christ, the bloody crusades, the violent intolerance of all monotheistic religions, and the present-day jihad in Islam are all examples of the presence of violence in religion. These examples may be said to point out that religions may revert to violence to achieve their goals. It may be the religious leaders contributing to violence by supporting wars and terrorism to establish the power of religious authority, or it may be the political leaders exploiting religion for their own personal benefit or for establishing their ideologies. Thus, the presence of violence in societies in the form of wars or terrorism is always perpetuated. Perception and lived experience are very important to people, especially to children, because they practice what they see. Therefore, the rapid development of computer technology, the creation of internet web, help people to be exposed easily to violent stimuli. The result has been a shocking global increase in cyber aggression and victimization. Likewise, extended exposure to violent media entertainment leads children to accept violence more easily. Anderson points out that modern society must beware of creeping cultural shifts toward greater acceptance of violence. Besides these factors, easy availability of guns, alcohol, and drugs contribute further to the escalation of violence. In a report on gun crime issued by United Nations in 2004, USA was reported first, Chile second, and Turkey third. In 2012 alone, a United Nations Office of Drug and Crime report reveals 500,000 people were killed worldwide intentionally. In 2009, according to official figures issued by Turkish government, with 13,424 murders, Turkey ranked first among NATO countries, while Spain was 20th with 34 murders. The same source reported Turkish crime rates increased 58% between 2011 and 2014. As far as rape, another form of violence, has been difficult to compile all cases of rape because a large number of them go unreported. According to a database compiled by OECD, of the 1,071 reported rape cases in 2008, Turkey was ranked 30th among 84 countries. Ministry of Justice issued available 2009 figures which showed that murder rate of women in Turkey increased by 1,400%. In 2002, 66 women were killed, while 953 women were murdered during the first 6 months of 2009. The shocking crime statistics around the world suggest that there is a correlation between crime rates and cultural and social conditions of a country. The less civilized or developed a country is, the higher is the crime rate. This is the society of modern man, and it is observed also by dramatic artists. Their observations are reflected in their plays. To do this, dramatists needed a new approach to represent the disturbing and confusing material they wished to use in their plays. The new theater is not speculative, it is experiential. In-your-face theater, a term coined by Alex Sears, is the new theater, which is presented which presented a break with conventional codes to confront the audience with the shocking and the vulgar. Sears claims the plays associated with interface theater are those that takes the audience, quote, by the scruff of the neck and shake it until it gets the message, unquote. The characters suddenly become violent and perform all kinds of atrocities. Thus, the audience experience the emotions presented on the stage rather than identifying themselves with the characters. Sarah Kane wrote Blasted as a mirror to reflect the deeply embedded violence in daily life. Most of her characters are or were subjected to violence, cruelty, torture, and cannibalism. The play is about a middle-aged journalist, Ian, and a childlike young woman, Kate, who are reuniting at a hotel room in Leeds. Ian works as a local reporter and reports events related to violence. When he reports, his language is neutral. It sounds as if he is reporting an unimportant, ordinary event and not what, for example, a serial killer did. He tends to blame the victim and not the victimizer. Apart from his work as a journalist throughout the play, there are implications that he is involved in some sort of a secret business. He is always in a state of nervous agitation, is expecting a call from an unidentified person, is fearful, and takes out his gun whenever there's a knock on the door. While talking with Kate, he mentions that he might have murdered some people as a part of his duty to his government. This may have been the reason for his detached, neutral way of reporting a violent incident, because frequent exposure to violence desensitizes people. As he is talking or dressing or undressing, he gets fits of coughing and suffers from a terrible pain in his lungs and stomach, but does not hesitate to drink bottles of gin. He is intoxicated all the time. He probably is consumptive or has lung cancer. With his attacks of pain and coughing, he attracts Kate's sympathy and he wants to have sex with her, but she refuses. To this refusal, he reacts with verbal attacks on Kate and her brother and humiliates them. He calls them retarded, stupid, Joey, and then says that he wants to protect Kate and that he loves her. So he oscillates between love and hate, between good and bad moods. He treats her as an object. In the meantime, he tells that he is divorced from his wife and his relations with his son are not as they should be. Thus, his unstable family life and his weak social attachments are revealed. Once again, he makes advances to Kate, who is constantly stuttering, giggling, and sucking her thumb, but she refuses and laughs hysterically. Then she has a fit that leaves her unconscious. She is seemingly slow-witted, childlike, and has been subjected several times to violence in the form of rape. As a result of her refusal and her passing out, Ian's mood changes, his irritation and frustration increase, his verbal violence escalates, and his repressed and oppressed anger develops into physical violence, and he rapes Kate. This way, he punishes Kate with his violent response to her humiliation of him. Thus, the hotel room becomes a scene of domestic violence. In short, Ian's unstable self-esteem, his lack of long-term goals, his uncaring attitude toward violence, Kate's provocation, his frustration, his fearful expectations of external interferences, his changing moods, together with the effect of alcohol and the presence of his gun, reinforce his aggression. In addition, his biological condition of stomach and lung discomfort and pain, his anger at Kate, and his lacking of a proper family escalate Ian's aggression and make him ready for displaying violence. His violence, which is also called hostile violence and is driven with anger, is affective, that is, impulsive, unplanned, and is reactive. As Anderson and Bushman's general aggression model suggests a conjunction of multiple personal, social, and cultural factors have formed the basis of and have triggered Ian's violence, which consists of 3 phases. The first is the input of personal and situational variables. The second is the influence of these inputs on his internal state and the failure of his mental appraisal. And the third phase is his being led to the final impulsive act of violence. The next morning, Kate wants to leave and goes to the bathroom. While she is there, a soldier breaks into the hotel room. Then the room is hit by a bomb and is shattered to pieces. This suggests that the same hotel room is now converted to a war zone. That is, it is no longer a domestic place, but is a public ground. Whatever is going to happen there will represent what might take place in the outside world. The unnamed soldier is hungry for both for food and sex. He devours the breakfast Ian had ordered and then begins looking for Ian's girlfriend to have sex with, but Kate had escaped from the bathroom window. The soldier begins talking about the atrocities of the Civil War outside and tells about the acts of violence he has committed. He raped women and children and tortured and killed men. He also talks about how his girlfriend was raped, murdered, and chopped up, and her eyes were eaten by a group of men. Having been both a participant of and a witness to brutal scenes, the soldier is filled with hatred, revenge, fear, and frustration. Thus, he believes he has a moral justification for violence. The gun he is carrying is also a support for his violent acts. Then, with the gun put to Ian's head, the soldier rapes him, sucks out his eyes, and eats them, and commits suicide. His cannibalism is not a survival technique, but is the result of his traumatic experience of witnessing the cannibalistic actions performed on his girlfriend. It is a psychological response of anger and frustration. At the same time, it is revenge and punishment. His is an instrumental type of violence because he is avenging his traumatic experience not on the victimizers, but on someone else whom he is using as an instrument for his revenge on behalf of his girlfriend. That is, he is making reparations to her. Also, with this act, he is relieving his depressive guilt of previous violence. His violence-inducing factors as deprivation, exposure to violence, witnessing of fear-inducing events, and different life conditions lead the soldier to use reactive violence, which is a response to prior provocation and is accompanied with anger. His violence is premeditated. It is deliberate, slow, and instrumental. The soldier's violence is a proof that violence breeds violence, that it follows a cycle of escalation. That is, an initial event occurs, and it is retaliated from a biased perspective by a higher level of retaliation, which escalates, and the final stage is self-inducing violence, that is suicide. The soldier is brought to this point because by his violent acts he has diminished his pain and has internalized his anger. Besides, he has a lower sense of belonging since the loss of his girlfriend. It implies that he has no other important attachments in his life. This added to other social factors such as having no other employment, loneliness, and repeated exposure to violence and to fearful situations of war lead him to suicide. And then we see that there is further violence taking place in the same hotel room. Kate comes back with a baby that a woman has given her outside, and they bury the dead baby under floorboards, and she goes out again to find food, but in her absence we see that Ian digs out the baby and devours the baby. So this is again an example of further escalation of violence occurring in the play. So I will not go into more details about that. So it is, what Ian was doing, again, was not the satisfaction of his hunger, but it is the traumatizing experience he has had with the soldier, and his frustrations and his fears, and now, you know, he's blinded and there's nothing he can do about himself. And then we see Kate coming back, and she has brought some food, but she's bleeding, and it is implied that she has been raped by the soldiers outside. So she has been subjected once more to further violence. And we see that Ian is wishing to commit suicide, but he cannot. But eventually he dies with relief. In the last scene, Kate is feeding him, and although it is not explicit, the scene is supposed to be taking place in hell. Sarah Kane created all this monstrosity connected with the wartime as a result of the brutal war in Bosnia. The play is filled with filthy language and obscenities. There is nudity, sex, cannibalism, suicide, murder, homosexual rape, unlimited alcohol consumption, and violence. With all these extreme happenings, Kane is attempting to hold a mirror to the sexual, verbal, and physical violence in the society. By shocking her audience and by putting them into direct contact with violence through the three characters who appear to have been exposed to both proximate and distal social and cultural factors, are the prototypes of Anderson's general aggression model on stage. With this play, Sarah Kane is acknowledging the traumatizing events in the society. She is also drawing attention to the harm violence can cause human beings, because she believes that, quote, violence is the most urgent problem we have as species and the most important thing we need to confront. All of her characters are victims of violence, cruelty, torture, and endless cycle of cannibalism. In Kane's world, violence is inescapable because, in addition to the existing negative sociocultural conditions in the society, individuals have enduring motivations, attitudes, values, and beliefs that develop out of their prior history. In conclusion, it may be claimed that Sarah Kane presents cruelty deeply embedded in daily life, acknowledges the traumatizing events in the present-day society. Contrary to a general belief that violence is the result of human instincts, she shares the view that violence is not only in the person, but also it is in this culture. It is the society with its sociocultural makeup and the personality of the individual that are responsible for the presence of violence in society. So it may be claimed that unless sociocultural conditions in a society are improved, violence will perpetuate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Canlı, for this mirror. Well, very difficult to look into a mirror kind of thing. I'm afraid we have a lot to actually relate to what you have explained in relation to Sarah Kane's Blasted. Now the floor is open for questions and possible comments. Or that we're all a bit afraid. Ayşegül Can, lütfen.
Thank you, Professor John, for this beautiful presentation of a great plague of our time, violence. We have it on the TV screen all the time as well. What do you think? By watching violence all the time, being the spectator of violence, do we somehow get used to it?
Definitely.
And take it for granted?
Yes, definitely. We think it is normal, and why not? This is the way of the life, and so it is there. It is an ordinary, everyday event. So, I mean, if we spend one day without violence, we have a surprise and we say, oh, how come we have no violence? I mean, unfortunately, being exposed to violence all the time, constantly, perpetually, as I have said, desensitizes people. And we accept it as normal, and we are not shocked by it anymore.
All the more. I experienced it myself the other day as I was watching one of those TV serials. You know, two young guys were taking revenge and they shot this evil young man who had done a lot of awful things. And watching that, I myself felt that I felt relieved. Really? That didn't make me happy at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was thinking of the actual staging of it and the acting of it. You know, I was putting myself in place of those actors and actresses. I couldn't act in a play like that. Are they doing it willingly or? I mean, I was thinking of the director and the producer and all those people in all those scenes. Are they comfortable doing things like that? On stage, I'm not a dramatist. You know, I have no idea how drama has.
An answer first, and then I was so excited. I'd like to add something.
Please do.
Well, actually, hocam, 2 or 3 years ago in the classroom, I had my students translate a few scenes from Blasted and had into Turkish, because English acts like a barrier. It doesn't really hit you in your face when it's, for most of us at least. And then so I had them translated into Turkish, and they said, hocam, how can we really translate this with all the obscenities? I said, just go ahead, you know, what is there is there. And then they acted it out, and you wouldn't believe it. They did such a good job, and it was only then, and they enjoyed it. They enjoyed the violence and everything, and all those scenes that Gülsen Hoca was talking about. It was acted in the classroom, and the students then understood the real nature of in-your-face theater, how in-your-face it was. I'm sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. Thank you. Thank you. Well, actually, I think those actors and actresses are, after all, professionals, and they make no distinction. So they just accept it as normal. So after all, I mean, they are actors.
All the while I was wondering, not on part of the actors and actresses, but on the part of the audience, whether being made uncomfortable by such scenes, whether they just walked out.
Well, yes, a lot of people among the audience have been or have left, and you know, you should see the comments of critics after the first performance, what they wrote in the papers. And they said, you know, it's disgusting, this filth, and how is it possible that the Royal Theatre, Royal Court, could prepare or could put it on and, you know, expect people to come and see it. So, I mean, so the reception was not very positive at the beginning.
May I?
Please.
Actually, what worries me more, parallel to what Ayşegül Hoca was saying, was this is a play of what was the year? I forgot. Well, in 1990 was it? Well, anyway, I forgot.
Mid-90s.
Something like that. I forgot.
Yes.
But you see, you would expect that this is the ultimate violence you would be seeing on stage. But last year I had included, we had worked on a book with Sibel. I had included Mark Ravenhill's, one of Mark Ravenhill's plays, which I was putting off for a while because, you know, I didn't feel like teaching it. And then, and I felt very disturbed and disgusted myself. So, where is all this going to end? In one of the words, in the words of one of the critics, where is it all going to end? In the 10 years' time, after this play was performed, we're getting even more and more sickening violence, which is not just verbal, but physical, emotional, whatever, sexual, and some of which we can't accept as normal. Only very, very sick people can, I would say, can accomplish that. But what's also worrying is this play was first performed at the Royal Court Theatre, like you mentioned, but Mark Ravenhill's plays, and some even worse, are now performed at the National. The National is now open to such plays. I'm not saying that theatres should continue to be conservative in their choice of repertory, but I mean, I thought I was a liberal, but I object to this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Well, actually, I think, you know what, a while ago in the morning, Ayşegül Hoca was talking about the mysteries, the pageants, and, you know, they're the nailing of Christ, that scene, and how the people, the spectators, must have been feeling in the presence of such a scene. So eventually, through the years and centuries, I think we are grown used to seeing more and more violence, and you know, we take it just, you know, as natural. And you know, even in Shakespeare's plays, we have a lot of violence.
I was just going to say that I was reminded of it. Carol Ann Duffy, the present poet laureate, was criticized and was taken off GCSEs for a while because her poems included a lot of violence. So she protested with a poem in which actually she simply cites Shakespeare's plays. How many dead in Shakespeare's blah blah, and who killed who, and who was raped, and who was murdered, and stuff. Unfortunately, yes, violence seems to be actually a great material in representation.
Yes.
And any further comments or questions? Well, then thank you very much again.
I hope I will not create another sensation.